Welcome to this conversation about the Anzac legend, which has been at the heart of our unit, and I'd suggest this video in 2018 is a very, very important video that I want you to take notes from, write down ideas, write down questions as you watch it, because I suspect this is going to be part of the emphasis of our end of semester exam. Now remember, the end of semester exam is unseen to teachers and to you, the students, but this is a key concept in our unit plan. The teachers should have been discussing this throughout your unit, so therefore I think this is a good space to put some extra time and effort in your study. Now when we look at the Anzac legend, it's very important for us firstly to get our head around how we define this concept, and that's the first part of this video. The second is a lesser part: who created and how it was created and how it was promulgated, spread, how did it stick in Australia. And then finally we need to address perhaps the more interesting, controversial element of it. And it's the nature of the Anzac legend. Is it a legend or a myth? And what aspects of the Australian war experience have been left out of the legend? And perhaps what's that say about us as a nation, as a people who hold this legend so sacred within our national experience. So let's have a look at the first part. What's the Anzac legend? Okay, so the first thing we need to get our head around is a basic definition. And here it is. And if necessary, remember to pause your video from time to time as we discuss these ideas and get your head around it. You might want to play the idea back a couple of times. Firstly, then, the Anzac legend is a concept which suggests that Australians of the First World War possessed shared and unique qualities, traits, characteristics that revealed themselves on the battlefield. And in particular, the battlefield where these traits, characteristics, qualities were revealed was at Gallipoli. Suggestion that these are shared, unique qualities, traits, characteristics of Australians that revealed themselves on the battlefields of World War I, especially at Gallipoli. The legend suggests these qualities, traits, characteristics were distinctly Australian, and that they go to the heart of the very nature of what it means to be Australian. So around schools in Australia, even to this day, we've got a statement of Australian values, and it has imagery from Gallipoli in the First World War underneath this set of values, as like a watermark on the artwork. In All Hallows, this is on the wall in student services. If you went down and had a look at it, you'd see it on there. It has to be displayed in a lot of schools. So what are these qualities? The qualities usually identified as being really core to the concept are, and there are 5 key ones. It can be expressed in slightly different words at times, and they can overlap. But there's 5. Here we go. Number 1, endurance. It's usually expressed purely as the word endurance, but sometimes comes across as resilience. Some students sometimes call it grit. The ability to keep going when times are tough. Endurance. Courage. Often students use the word bravery instead. Ingenuity. Resourcefulness. The ability to come up with ingenious, inventive ways, resourceful ways to solve problems. Good humour. In Australia's case, in the Anzac legend, we often talk about a larrikin sense of humour. Generally having a sense of humour. Larrikin sense of humour is often a mocking sense of humour. A sense of humour that's laughing at danger, laughing at authority, laughing at structures and routines which military life was full of. This larrikin sense of humour is irrepressible, can't be put down. It might be a good one to Google and see some of their examples out there, this larrikin sense of humour. but a good humour. And, of course, mateship. It's this loyalty of the body of men who are loyal to each other. Okay? Loyal between mates. Sticking together as a group, a body of loyalty tied to each other. Difficult to express. Loyalty, not to nation, but to friendship, to mates. Now, according to the legend, there's other elements. According to the legend, the Anzacs were essentially young men who were innocent in the ways of the world. They were almost naive. They were pure. They were without being corrupted in the ways of the world. They were athletic, physically fit. And there's some truth in that part of the legend, because the Australian soldiers who went to the First World War as part of the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, were particularly carefully selected for high levels of physical health and fitness, especially at the start of the war. They were stoic. They had what the British would call a stiff upper lip. They were strong in the face of hardship. Stoic, strong, silent, hard and never melting down. Stoic in the face of hardship. But at the same time, they possessed a laid-back, laconic sense of humour. The easy smile, the soft, gentle laugh, that when things got laughed, they sort of rolled with it. A laid-back, laconic sense of humour. The dry comment, not a very over-the-top humour, not a wise-cracking humour, but more a subtle observation of things that could be humorous in difficult situations. They're represented as often being very distrustful of authority. They believed in equality, that no person was any better than anybody else, that together they were one body of loyal mates who were all equal. Rank didn't matter too much to them, and they particularly therefore didn't like the British class system, the idea that some people are born into positions of authority and respect while others are working class, the aristocrats, the poor, the working class. They had no respect for that. They were egalitarian, distrustful of authority, and liked this sense of no classes, that they were all one. And that links to mateship. So those understandings all tie back to those 5 qualities that's really important for you to know and to be able to recognise when you're looking at posters and newspaper articles and so on, the primary sources of the time. Now, the thing that we need to remember with all of this idea of the Anzac legend is it starts to get a little bit more controversial and into the news headlines when people use the legend as a mirror on ourselves as a nation. The Anzac legend can be used by some people in Australian society as a mirror to reflect almost a template of the typical Aussie. So the next step with people here, sometimes I'll go, well, all Aussies endure. All Aussies are courageous. All Aussies have ingenuity. All Aussies have a good sense of humour. All Aussies believe in mateship. This lens of what it means to be Australian and this conversation about what it means to be Australian sometimes gets connected up to the Anzac legend. And if we're going to do that, we need to keep thinking about who's this Anzac legend about and who does it leave out? Because if we take the Anzac legend and apply it to all of us as a nation, maybe we're not paying enough respect to some people who were never intended to be part of this story of what happened during the First World War. Part of the legend actually also suggests that Gallipoli was the birth of Australia as a nation. And it's a really interesting historical conversation there as well. So, who created the legend? How did this creation take place? Well, firstly, the first time we see anything resembling the Anzac legend comes out of the writings of a British war correspondent, a journalist, a reporter at Gallipoli, who was British, mind you, British, at Anzac Cove in Gallipoli. And his name was Alice Ashmead Bartlett. He spoke of the Australians being a race of athletes who were bigger. They were giants among men. He really talked up the Anzacs that came ashore at Gallipoli. The next person to really run with this idea and build upon it is C.E.W. Bean. His first name was Charles, but often you'll see sources just call him C.E.W. Bean. He was also a war correspondent, a journalist, a reporter at Gallipoli. Now, Bean goes on to become the official Australian historian, and there are volumes of his writing about the First World War. The official Australian historian appointed by the government for World War I. He develops the concept of the Anzac legend that he first started to write about at Gallipoli alongside Alice Ashmead Bartlett. And so therefore it became the lens, the theme, the way of seeing Australia's involvement in this horrific experience of the Great War. There was so much pain there. There were so many lives lost. People in Australia were wanting to know why this war mattered. And Charles Bean, in his official histories, built a story that said these men had certain characteristics that were revealed in them at Gallipoli, and that this has laid the foundation of nationhood. Now, it's a good story, and we can talk about the bits of it that are true and the bits of it that aren't. But very, very importantly, it's a myth, a legend that is being built around a group of people in a particular time and place that's being applied to an entire nation from time to time by different people. And we need to be a little bit careful about that. The third name that gets mentioned, by the way, alongside Ashmead Bartlett and Bean, is Sir Keith Murdoch. And Sir Keith Murdoch goes on to run a great publishing empire, and now I'm going to say his grandson was Rupert Murdoch, who now owns Fox Studios. He owns 20th Century Fox in the United States, the company that ultimately creates The Simpsons and TV shows like that. Same Murdoch family. Now, the legend, how did they communicate it? How did it get out there? Well, firstly, it was in the newspaper reports that these two journalists saw published around Britain and Australia in particular. It shows up in themes of the recruiting posters, the propaganda works, the artworks which are associated with the Gallipoli experience in Australia. So those writings, those qualities, become theme in artwork and advertising. Next, it shows up in the official histories of the First World War. And those official histories, by Charles Bean, were often a way into studying the war and teaching the war. So it makes its way even into classrooms. And after the war, as people tried to remember, tried to make sense of the war, elements of these stories began to be told in the Anzac Day commemorations. It's interesting that some of the early Anzacs themselves, some of the AIF, were uncomfortable with parts of this legend building around their experience. They even had a word for it, Anzacary. And Anzacary was what AIF and Anzacs called politicians, people who weren't there, turning Anzac experiences into something more, that something perhaps that it was never for them as soldiers. So what are left out? Let's talk about what's left out of the legend. The significant issue is the way the legend has been used as if it's the entire Australian war experience, which it's not. The Anzac legend has become a way of defining and understanding Australianness, and therefore it's got problems, as we've said. There are a number of critics, and the critics use the word myth more than legend, and I've tried to use it a little bit interchangeable in here so you can make your own mind up whether you believe it's a legend built by these soldiers or a myth that's been made up by journalists. That's the big conversation for historians. The critics of the legend suggest the legend gives those people trying to understand the Australian war experience, and by the way, what it might mean to be Australian, only a very narrow lens, a very narrow way of seeing the world of the war. So the Anzac experience will leave out the experiences of those who weren't at Gallipoli. As such, it tends to emphasise males, and white males at that, the Anglo-Celtic, the people from the British Isles and Ireland. And that was a stereotype of what the typical Anzac soldier was. By the way, it might have been the majority, but it certainly wasn't everyone there. Any experience that was outside that lens, anything outside the viewfinder, if you're looking on a camera or looking in the frame of your phone, anything outside the lens was either completely overlooked or was diminished, was shrunk in comparison to the experiences of the soldiers at Gallipoli for those 8 months from April 1915 to January 1916. Now, if we're going to argue the Anzac legend gives us a template for understanding what it means to be Australian, then we'd argue it lacks in inclusivity. It's not including everyone if we're talking about it being what it means to be Australian. So who's left out? Firstly, it leaves out anyone who fought on the Western Front and other locations in the war, such as Palestine. And we need to remember that the battles of the Western Front were huge and perhaps of more significance to the war than those in the Gallipoli campaign. Okay, it tends to be criticised as a legend because it expresses only a small part of large wartime experiences. If the Anzac legend is just a lens through which we see the war, we need to see what's outside the lens. The lens traditionally has been about white men at Gallipoli. I wonder if that's changed in recent times in some of the advertising and posters put out by the Anzac Day Commemoration Committee. I think you might have seen different things on the news and in our news stories and in posters and art. The Anzac legend is said to have largely excluded the experiences of people on the Western Front, as we've said, people on those battle fronts who were not white or male, and that included Indigenous Australians who went to the First World War, Asian Australians who went to the First World War, and women who went to the First World War. It leaves them out to some extent. Now, some people say it's okay, that it's not about the nurses, but it does leave people out of the way we talk about the Australian experience. It leaves out the home front, the children, the families left behind and others. So when we talk about the Anzac experience, when we talk about the Anzac legend, we need to remember we're not talking about other people, and perhaps their experiences are very important for us to include in the way we talk about the war. So, there are criticisms of the Anzac legend and a way it talks about a specific group of characteristics and a specific group of people. But bigger issues arise if we talk about the Anzac legend as if it is explaining what it means to be Australian. And I'll leave you think about how much you agree with those criticisms or how much you think the Australian legend is a legitimate way of expressing the experiences of the First World War.